Today we're going to talk about American foreign policy uh, in the Progressive Era. So if you want to follow along, this is simply titled American Foreign Policy in the Progressive Era. Okay, so our three Progressive Era presidents are Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. So if you kind of want a reference point for some of this stuff, you can look and see when they were president. Now, after the Spanish-American War, the U.S. becomes a great power. Europe recognizes America as a great power. The French newspaper Le Temps said, "What passes before our eyes is the appearance of a new power of the first order." The London Times said, "This war must effect a profound change in the world, in the whole attitude and policy of the United States. In the future, America will play a part in the general affairs of the world such as she had never played before." And that's really true because, this is 1900. We've got World War I and II coming up. Now, Teddy Roosevelt wholeheartedly agrees with this. He wants America to be a great power. He thinks America should accept its role as a great power. Now, in 1902, America withdraws from Cuba, but some other stuff is going to go on during his presidency. The Panama Canal is going to be built between 1903 and 1914. And Teddy Roosevelt is also going to issue something called the Roosevelt Corollary. Basically, what this is it says the United States is going to be the policeman of the Caribbean. So you had the Monroe Doctrine back in the early years of the Republic. It basically told Europe to stay out of the Caribbean. So our job was to keep them out of affairs there. Now the Roosevelt Corollary says we're going to intervene in the Caribbean if we need to. Now, Teddy Roosevelt talked about how the United States needed to showcase its power. He said, "To make all foreign powers understand that when we have adopted a line of policy, we have adopted it definitely and with the intention of backing it up with deeds as well as words. Speak softly and carry a big stick." The big stick Teddy Roosevelt is talking about is the Navy. Now, if you look at slide 6, you can kind of see America has two oceans on each side, the Pacific and the Atlantic. If you want to travel between those two oceans, you have to go all the way down past South America. America really needs to be a two-ocean navy to protect itself, but it's really hard to travel between the two oceans. It takes a lot of time. So Teddy Roosevelt sees it's his job is to kind of acquire a two-ocean navy and figure out how to make that travel between the Pacific and the Atlantic quicker. So what he does is he signs an agreement with Britain to give up the rights of building a canal in Central America. Teddy Roosevelt wants to lease land from Colombia to build a canal in their province of Panama. The Colombian legislature says no to Teddy Roosevelt. They don't want to lease Panama to him. So what does Teddy Roosevelt decide to do? Maybe he could just seize it. What he decides is to support a rebellion of Panama against Colombia. So the Panamanians revolt against Colombia, and really quickly the United States recognizes them as a legitimate government. So basically the agreement is if we support Panamanian independence, they will grant land to us to build the Panama Canal. So that's what ends up happening. We kind of we don't take Panama, but we help them get their independence. Later on in the 1920s, we paid Colombia $22 million to kind of say we were sorry for this. But what Teddy Roosevelt does is he gets going building the Panama Canal. It's a huge project. It's a big undertaking. The French had tried it decades earlier and they had totally failed. But Teddy Roosevelt succeeds where others didn't. It took 35,000 workers many, many years to complete. Doctors have to find ways to deal with the disease going on in there, but thousands of workers still die. There's swamps that have to be drained. There's sea locks that have to be constructed. It eventually opens in 1914, and it cut about 8,000 nautical miles off the trip between the east and the west coast. So if you look at slide 18, you can see how the Panama Canal really makes travel between the east and the west coast quicker, and it also allows America's Navy to move between the two oceans quicker. So if there's a problem in Asia, the Navy can be there quickly. If there's a problem in Europe, the Navy can be on that side of the world quickly. Now, America also deals with China during the early 1900s. In the mid 1890s, there was something called the Sino-Japanese War. China and Japan go to war, and then China starts getting divided up into spheres of influence, not necessarily colonies, but spheres of influence where Japan, Russia, Germany, France, and Britain basically say, this is our sphere of influence, the rest of Europe stay out. Now, the United States doesn't want colonies in China, but the United States wants to trade with China. So in 1899, Secretary of State John Hay, sent his open door note to the great powers, and he basically said, we want an open door in China. We want to be able to trade with China, and we don't want the other European powers to impede our rights to free trade. Now, the Chinese didn't like this. In 1900, there was something called the Boxer Rebellion. There was a group called the Righteous and Harmonious Fist. They were Chinese nationalists. They rebelled against all foreigners. They didn't really like, Russian or Japanese or British or French or whoever. They just saw them as foreigners. So they killed foreign missionaries. They besieged foreign cities. They attacked foreign diplomats. Basically, the great powers, Europe, Japan, America, they send thousands of troops into China to crush this Boxer Rebellion. America insists, though, that China be preserved as a territorial and an administrative entity. Also, during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, there was the Russo-Japanese War. Basically, Russia and Japan go to war. The Japanese defeat the Russian Navy at Port Arthur. Roosevelt basically recognized Japan as a great power. A lot of European countries didn't necessarily want to because they saw, Asia as inferior to Europe. But Teddy Roosevelt recognized that Japan was up there with the other great powers. He said the Japanese are a wonderful and civilized people, entitled to stand in absolute equality with all the other peoples of the civilized world. Japan has a paramount interest in what surrounds the Yellow Sea, just as the United States has a paramount interest in what surrounds the Caribbean. In 1905, the United States recognized Japan's protectorate over Korea. Roosevelt helps bring the Japanese and Russians to the peace table. He ends up negotiating a peace treaty in New Hampshire in 1905. President Roosevelt gets the Nobel Peace Prize for this. There are also times of tension with Japan. In 1906, San Francisco segregates Asian students. This upsets Japan. So the next year, Teddy Roosevelt negotiates something called the Gentleman's Agreement. Basically, Japan agrees to limit immigration to the United States, and America won't be as harsh towards its Asian citizens. So it's kind of seen as a middle way, I guess you could say. Another thing that Teddy Roosevelt did is he advocated military preparedness. He sent something called the Great White Fleet around the world. So he sent the American Navy basically on a worldwide trip from 1907 to 1909. They visited Japan in 1908. Teddy Roosevelt signed something called the Root Takahira Agreement. Basically, it confirmed the status quo in the Pacific. A lot of Americans and a lot of Japanese are starting to realize that, the Pacific Ocean is what the United States and Japan are focused on. So there might be a future conflict someday. So they kind of try to work it out so there won't be. It supports the principle of free trade and equal trading opportunities in China. Other things, Teddy Roosevelt went to a conference in Spain in 1906. He kind of helped resolve the first Moroccan crisis. Basically, Germany and France were rattling their sabers. This is right on the eve of World War I, so he went there and helped play a role in peacemaker. So it's kind of strange. Teddy Roosevelt is kind of seen as this bombastic, militaristic leader, but he's also a great peace negotiator as well. After Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft became president. His foreign policy was referred to as dollar diplomacy. Basically, he wanted to combine political and economic interest. He wanted to substitute dollars for bullets, so it's not as rough, not as harsh as Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy. He increases investment in China, Central America, and the Caribbean. He supports the Chinese Revolution of 1911. Chinese nationalists led by Sun Yat-sen overthrew the Manchu dynasty. Now, Chinese nationalists want to liberate China from Japan. This will eventually put America on a course for war with Japan later on. Woodrow Wilson, kind of the last progressive president, he disliked Roosevelt and Taft's foreign policy. He thought it was too harsh on other countries. So his diplomacy became known as moral diplomacy. He said, "It is a very perilous thing to determine the foreign policy of a nation in terms of material interest." Now, he still uses the military to intervene, but he does it in support of constitutional liberty in the world. So basically, Woodrow Wilson is going to use the military just like Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft did, but he's going to do it for these kind of grand ideological reasons, not material reasons. He said in a 1913 foreign policy speech, "America will never again seek one additional foot of territory by conquest." Wilson vowed to support human rights, national integrity, opportunity. He said violating these principles would make ourselves untrue to our own traditions. Probably the biggest thing that Woodrow Wilson had to deal with prior to World War I was the Mexican Revolution. In 1911, Mexico was in revolt. The dictator, Diaz, he encouraged American investment, but he is toppled later by another Mexican leader. Basically, Wilson ends up taking sides with who he sees as more of the liberal constitutional side of the Mexican Revolution. But even the Mexicans who are revolting against dictatorship, they still don't like Wilson sticking his nose in their business. Eventually, Wilson throws American troops into the Mexican Revolution. The Americans occupy the port of Veracruz in 1914. America and Mexico come close to war. Like I said, this is just on the eve of World War I. During the Mexican Revolution, this bandit Pancho Villa, he crossed into New Mexico and killed 16 Americans. So Wilson sends 10,000 troops into Mexico under John J. Pershing. He's going to be important later on. He'll be the main commander in World War I for the Americans. They stayed in Mexico until they needed to go to Europe in 1917. Eventually, the Carranza government, the government that Wilson supported, had elections and ratifies the Constitution. Wilson recognizes their government, but that would be Wilson's biggest diplomacy issue until World War I. And if you look at slide 32 and 33, you can kind of see all the places that the American military, the United States government sent troops in during the Progressive Era. So a lot of intervention in Latin America, but everything's about to change when we get into World War I.